Today is the 21st Sunday of the year. Our gospel text is taken from Matthew chapter 16, verses 13 through 20. You're very familiar with this text. It's the event where Jesus says to the disciples, "Who do they say the Son of Man is?" Various responses are given in reaction to this question. But Peter says, "You're the Christ. You're the anointed of God." Jesus affirms Peter, says, "You are blessed, Peter. This is a revelation. You didn't think of this yourself. You are the rock on which I will build my church, and the gates of Hades shall not hold out against it." It's that last statement that I would like to spend some time on today. The gates of Hades shall not hold out against it. This is a reference to death. Hades was a Greek god, and in Jewish belief at that time, many spoke of the place of death as Hades, sometimes Sheol. Whatever, the belief was generally that death was both inevitable and indomitable. It had the final say. And Jesus is saying, "Not anymore, Peter. Not in my kingdom. You will prevail against the kingdom of death because of me, because of my dying." This is hugely paradoxical, complex, mysterious, but it is the very heart of our faith, that the death of Jesus is the source of life. Let's have a little bit of a think about that. In 1959, a book was published called Life Against Death by an American Christian writer, quite a profound thinker, Norman O. Brown. And he offers a more or less summary statement of his thesis in that book. And he says, "Man aggressively builds immortal cultures and makes history in order to fight death." He's making a huge claim there, one that many serious authors would agree with, namely that the fact of death in life tends to shape our lives. How we respond to death in life has an immense impact on how we live. What we do, what we think, what we believe about death is not only significant for the believer, it is significant for the unbeliever. Some responses in history and today are quite destructive and in fact leave us entrapped by death. Some responses are constructive and life-giving, and the fact of death leads to life. St. Paul says in his first letter to the Corinthians that death has no more victory. Where is your sting? Jesus dying has destroyed death. Now, clearly, we will die. The essence of this, it seems to me, is that the dying about which St. Paul speaks, the dying about which Norman O. Brown speaks, and many others, is the dying of daily living. Death is not just an event at the end of life. Living and dying intermingle throughout life. They're organically linked. There is no living without dying. Dying is part of my days, every day, constantly. The choices that I make with regard to that will determine whether my response to this fact of death becomes a source of more death or a source of greater living and freedom. It is our claim in Jesus we can live into the dying. The day will ask with great confidence, because it will lead to freedom, not to death. To deny the dying will lead to death. Let me suggest a few examples of this. The dying of generosity. There is a certain sacrifice, a dying in being generous, magnanimous. The dying involved there will lead to life. We can choose that, or we can choose the death of meanness and selfishness and greed. That doesn't lead to life, it just leads to death. The dying of openness to others, to set aside our preferences. The pain involved in this is a certain dying. That can lead very reasonably to the expectation of life between us and through us to others. And that's a better choice than the death of prejudice or bigotry, or sectarianism or racism. These entrap us in a culture of death if we persistently submit to them. What is on offer in Jesus Christ is the opposite, a dying that leads to life. The dying involved in honesty, sometimes that can be most painful. Much can be lost in being honest, telling the truth. Much can be gained too. This is the path to freedom. This dying leads to living more deeply, as opposed to opting for the death in the lie and deceit and the refusal to be honest. In these practical, daily kinds of moments, we can see the difference between a dying that leads to living more deeply, with greater freedom, as opposed to a dying that is simply death. Death wins the day. Death is final. That is not the Christian response. That is not what our faith has on offer. Our life in Christ means that the dying we do brings us into communion with Him, with His great saving death. And in His dying is our freedom, is our life. The gates of death cannot hold out against Jesus. His dying has defeated death. This leads to an odd statement. Let me leave you with this odd statement. It seems to me a reasonable stance for the Christian to be a hope-filled pessimist. Hope-filled because of our life in Christ, because we act out of that belief and that confidence that He has conquered death, and we can safely do the dying that each day will ask of us, confident that it will lead to greater freedom and greater living, deeper living, richer living, more joyous living. But a certain pessimism is warranted, because in our culture, all around us, is this intense denial of death, this unwillingness to enter into the dying that would lead to living. And so we find ourselves entrapped in the death of greed, the death of individualism, the death of selfishness, etc., etc. And Don't be misled. You and I are all subject to the seduction of death. You and I, many times through our lives, will refuse the dying that would lead to living and choose instead death that leads simply to death. The point is that we can recover from that if we turn to Jesus Christ, if we choose the dying that leads to living.